Okay, at its most basic, Python is a calculator. And what I'm using now is called idle. It's one way of interacting with Python. Makes it a little easier than the command prompt. It gives me some color-coded things like that. There's other ones besides idle. Idle is the default that when you download Python. So that's what I'm working here. It's called an integrated development environment. So like I said, it's a calculator. If I type in 4 times 5 and press enter, I get 20. Maybe -3 times 2, I get -6. And I could do more fancy calculations like 3 times parentheses 7 minus 2 should give me 15. So there are a few things that don't work quite like you would imagine. So if I put a 2 and then a caret and then a 3, you might think that would give me 8 because in many applications, this caret here means raised to the power of. So 2 to the third power would be 8. That's not the case in Python. It is actually a nice mathematical understanding of what raising to a power actually is. So if I do want to raise 2 to the third power, I'll put a double multiplication there. It's kind of like it's accelerating the multiplication, which is really what's happening when you take an exponent. So mathematically, that's kind of a nice thing. Now you might wonder, well, what does the caret do if it doesn't raise to the power? That's a great question. Play around with it. You'll get into some things involving bits, but it's not a common mathematical operation. Okay, so we have these. Um, let's see, what about something like 2.5 or 2.2 times 2? So we can even do decimals here, and this is called a float. Float is when we have these right here are called integers, when we just have the whole numbers. If we do have a decimal, that would give us what's called a float. And let me also show you division, 5 divided by 2. So this tells us that we are working in Python 3. There's also a series of programs, software programs related to Python 2. And in Python 2, when you used a division like this, it would automatically round down to the lowest integer. The idea is many times it's easy to work with just basic integers. So we can do that in Python 3. It's called floor division, but Python wants to make really sure that that's what we want to do. So if we want to divide and then round down to the nearest integer, we do what's called a floor division. And that means we have 2 division signs, and that would round this down to 2. And if you have, say, 4 floor division, whoops, let's do 8. 8 floor division 2. If it lands on an integer, it would just stay as an integer. It's not going to take it down to the next integer there. So all of this to show you that Python can essentially be used as a calculator. However, Python's much more powerful than a calculator, so we don't typically limit ourselves to the calculator functions. We start to throw in what are called variables. And this is a little broader definition than what you think of as variables from algebra class, if you remember anything like that. Let me just say that I'm going to define a variable called x, and maybe I'll make that x equal to 5. When I say x equals 5 here, I want to be careful because what's really happening is I'm defining a new variable, or if there x already exists, I would overwrite it with this command. So I'm saying, no, I don't want x to equal that. I want x to equal this. And then this is the assignment key. In other words, I'm making an assignment to x. I'm going to decide what I want x to represent. And then I'm saying I want x to represent 5. So if I would do something like x plus 3, this would give me 8. It just works like you might think about it in algebra. Now where it gets tricky, because you're thinking of this as an equal sign, if I say something like x equals x plus 1, Well, in mathematics, this would be awkward because if we subtracted x from both sides, we'd end up with 0 equals 1, which is clearly false. But Python takes it all in stride and doesn't send us an error and anything like that. However, if we now check the value of x, notice that it's no longer assigned to the integer 5. It's now assigned to the integer 6. And the way we read this is, we want x to be assigned to the old value of x, which was 5, plus 1 more. And that's how x ends up equaling 6. And if we did this again, x equals x plus 1, and then we checked in on the value of x. I'm just going to press x there. We get x now equals 7. So this turns out to be such a common code that I'm going to teach you your first kind of Python savvy shortcut. It happens so often that we have a certain variable and we either want to add or subtract or multiply to that variable, that we do it like this. Here's the variable I'm talking about, x. And I'm going to be adding this. I'm going to be raising the value of x by 1. So this line right here means exactly the same thing as this line. These two, from Python's perspective, these two are exactly the same. So if I press enter here and check in on the value of x, it's now been raised to 8. If that sounds confusing at all, don't worry about it. I wanted to show it to you briefly because you are going to see it occasionally when you're looking online for help. So now you've at least seen it there. So that's essentially how Python can be used as a calculator, but also for variables. Now, where it becomes more than what you can do with a typical graphing calculator is we don't have to assign a variable to an integer, or even a number for that matter. Another type of variable would be called a string. So let's say I have the word banana. Notice that I put it in quotes. Now y, if I check in on the value of y, it says banana. Notice that here I had double quotation marks. And when it told me the value of y, it used single quotation marks. These are exactly the same. Whether you use single or double quotation marks, exactly the same. So if I would type in, and I can check this also, if I would type in banana equals, now watch what's going to happen here. I'm going to get an error. And why am I getting an error? All I wanted to do was to check whether these two things equaled each other. Well, remember, even though this is an equals sign, it doesn't really mean equals. It means we're assigning. We're trying to assign this value to this variable. But Python's telling us, hey, look, you can't take this series of letters and make it a variable. The string itself, you can't make that a variable. So if you're trying to check if two things are equal, we can do that, but we need two equal signs. And that tells us true. In other words, it tells us that this thing is exactly the same as this thing. And if we type in here something like 4 equals 6, that would be false because the integer 4 does not equal the integer 6. Okay, so showing you just a wider range of things, and there's lots of other things that a variable can be. It can be a list, a set, a dictionary. We'll get into those later. For now, I just want you to see that Python can be a basic calculator. I want you to see that you can assign variables. And I want you to see that there are a couple options of different variable types. There's integers, we saw float, and we saw what's called string. And we also saw that whether you use a single quote or a double quote doesn't matter in a string. If you're in a spreadsheet program like Excel, for example, it does matter. You have to do a double quote. In Python, you can do either one, and they're the same. Okay, well that's enough for that lecture. So this is the beginning of Python, and of course there's so much more that Python can do, but these are the very first baby steps.